Hey everyone, it's Mark Zielinski, and it's time for Pannithor. So I've got a very exciting episode for you today, and I should say we, because I'm joined here by the omnipresent Wiki Dave. How's it going, Wiki Dave?
All right, omnipresent. I don't know how I feel about that description, but all right, we'll go with that then.
There you go. And we have a very, very special guest today, Mr. James Dunbar. How are you, James?
I'm good. Thanks very much for having me, guys, especially at the hours that you're currently at. I understand. I think I've got the best deal of the three of us here. It's midday, so
There you go.
It's midday for you. I think it's 5 a.m. for Mark, and it's 10 p.m. on a Saturday for me. So that's the joys of the time zone, really.
yeah.
Absolutely. We call that worldwide coverage. Absolutely. So, but hey, it all worked out, and we're very, very happy to have you. And so you may hear a little ambiance there with James. I think he's in a little Italian village at the moment. So I really appreciate you joining us today.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure.
Fantastic. Well, yeah. So.
Yeah, I was going to say that we should mention the book that he actually wrote. So James actually has written Claws on the Plane, which is a book that has actually been in the making for a while. I think it was announced a couple of years ago now, and so we finally got it in our hands. So we might as well just do the classic interview beginning, which is James. I mean, who are you? What's your what have you done?
Okay, yeah. Well, as you've heard, I'm James Dunbar, and this is my first. Claws on the Plane will be my first novel. My first full novel I did. I was one of the authors who contributed to Nature's Night, and that was my first sort of published fiction. Actually, I don't know why I'm saying fiction. My first published work. So, that's pretty much where my writing credentials end. They begin and end here with this book, more or less. So, yeah.
Okay, so what are your kind of influences, and what kind of what books kind of got you into actually getting you to the point that you could write your own novel, or are you the classic kind of Lord of the Rings Hobbit kind of person and kind of moved into writing it yourself?
Absolutely, The Hobbit was very influential on me when I was quite young, and I found it, and I've just been a fan of all things fantasy, and all the sort of a lot of the Black Library stuff was sort of my jam, both 40K and the fantasy side of all that. And and it's expanded, obviously. I read a lot of things like, it's also kind of fantasy, sort of Stephen King, and these sort of works are ones I quite like for how he structures his stories. But as far as inspiration as a writer, no, I mean, it's just, the classic fantasy stuff, I guess. And also, being that I am, I do play Kings of War. I played Warhammer Fantasy back in the day. I'm definitely coming at this from the position of being a fan and gamer of these systems. So, yeah.
Yeah, I do agree with Stephen King. I think his autobiography on writing is really good. I would suggest any aspiring writer to read Stephen King's On Writing. I think it's a really, really good book. I don't know if you've read it yourself, but I just want to throw that in there. Now it's on my mind. So I guess yeah. Oh, cool. Not a lot of people know about it, so I kind of like to throw it out there. So I guess, you touched on Kings of War. So how did you get involved into actually writing it? Because there's one thing, just buying a box set from Mantic. There's another thing actually getting so involved that you're actually writing your own novel. So how did that go? Did they approach you? Did you approach them? How did that go? Or them, I mean, Winged Hussar.
Yeah, no, I approached them, absolutely. It really came about from playing in the Edge of the Abyss campaign. That was, I'm going to be very fuzzy now on dates of these things, but way back, sort of in second edition, Mantic ran this global campaign, this narrative campaign called The Edge of the Abyss. And at the time, I was in, I believe, my last year at uni and university, and so I was doing a lot of writing anyway, because I was doing a kind of humanities thing, but it was all sort of essay writing and things. And as they were doing that Edge of the Abyss campaign, there was the opportunity to sort of upload battle reports, and I just thought I'll just do a kind of narrative for these, and so I uploaded these narrative battle reports, and I just thought it was so fun that when the call went out from Wings Hussar, that was absolutely in my mind to if I ever had a good idea to just get in touch with those guys and pitch it to them. And when an idea came along, yeah, that's what I did, and Brandon jumped on it. It was really great. He really resonated with him, and yeah, it pretty much kicked off from there.
No, awesome. I mean, yeah, the Edge of the Abyss was, well, it's probably one of the biggest moments in Pannithor history at the moment in terms of the narrative as well. So it's really cool to see that that's what stemmed from it, is that you just played that summer campaign and kind of led to this. So after you pitched the idea, did they just say, "Hey, all right, just write the whole thing," or did they come to you with a few ideas of what you could actually write about?
It was pretty much my idea. There were a few sort of just modifications that Mantic. Well, actually, I say a few. It was literally one. The original version that I pitched sort of had goblins playing a much bigger part in the story. But Mantic said it was at the time the main correspondence with Mantic was through sort of Rob Berman. So you see, some of the dogs going. Beg pardon. The main correspondence with Mantic was through Rob Berman, who's obviously like at the time, and I imagine still to this day, is very much a goblin guy, and so he felt he had obviously the idea brewing for his goblin novel, so he suggested instead we swap the goblins out for orcs, which at the time was a bit of a head scratcher for me. I had to think about that and really go away and look at Mantic's orcs, but actually I think it worked out really well. They were a good fit for the story, so that was the main thing that I could change. Otherwise, it was pretty much my pitch exactly was just like accepted in structure and so on, and they pretty much left me to it. I didn't really. There was a few back and forths in the early bit where I was asking some questions, but for the most part, it was just I just got on with it, and they got on with their thing, and eventually it all came together.
Nice. So when it comes to the orcs, so in Kings of War, orcs culture, you could say, hasn't really been defined. It was definitely when people think of orcs in Kings of War, they always think the classic savage orcs. A lot of people refer it to Lord of the Rings orcs or to Warhammer orcs. But reading through the book, it felt that they had a little bit more culture. It kind of did definitely feel like kind of Warcraft orcs. I know I'm saying orcs a lot, but the Warcraft kind of type of orcs where they got a little bit of honor, a little bit of ritual, a little bit of customs. How did you approach writing orcs for Pannithor when it hasn't really been defined yet how orcs actually operate, you could say?
Yeah. I mean, it definitely was, as I say, a challenge. I think I had to have a good think about, because in a way, I mean, so remembering when I was doing this, I was the sort of lore source I had available at the time. I think when I was starting this book and when the only published Winged Hussar book at the time was that first Edge of the Abyss short stories collection, and the other source of lore was just the second edition book, which was great. It covered everything in a way that really sort of was very sort of inspiring with potential, but actual content was not so much. I mean, we got a lot more obviously later with the third edition book, but so yeah, certainly for orcs, it was interesting. Mantic's orcs at that time were depicted almost as being their defining characteristic was this. It wasn't even that they didn't have a culture, as in some sort of like there was a gap that Mantic hadn't filled. It was almost like a lack of culture was the defining characteristic of orc society. It was very basic social hierarchy rules of the strongest leads, and I think there was literally on the I don't even know if it was in the second edition book, but on the little blister pack for the metal orc crudger model, there's some reference to them eating their opponents after they've defeated them in the orcish society, and that was pretty much it. And the fact that any sort of sign of of order or civilization gives them a kind of psychic pain, is how it was described. Like it actually physically hurts Mantic's orcs to see anything ordered, or which I took to mean, any sort of civilizational type construct, whether it's like cities or art or anything of that sort. And so that was an interesting challenge, and it's an interesting position sort of Mantic put themselves in there, because I think from the perspective of writing stories in a world, that's something you can work with, this kind of very straightforward thing where there's not so much, at the time they literally, I think, I could be wrong here, but it was very much implied at the very least that there's not even this concept of like orcish clans and things. If you think back in like the Warhammer Fantasy, there were these very defined sort of clans that would have different motifs and so on in their setting. But the orcs, by contrast, it was sort of said, no, there's no sort of culture that carries on for different orcs. It's just whoever's the crudger is what's important, whoever's the leader of the orcs. And as soon as that crudger dies, it's just going to be complete, turnaround as far as who's leading who. There's going to be battles for leadership, and there'll be breakaways, and there'll be more come, and it all just sort of revolves around whoever's leader at the time, which is an interesting idea, but it makes it somewhat difficult for those players to necessarily come up with stuff, because they're sort of almost being told, you can't really define anything there so easily, with that implication of how it's sort of structured. So yeah, that was what I sort of had to work with. And I thought, well, even having no culture like that, or having those kind of things, that's going to have, you can't really have no culture. There will be something that comes into that space, and it's got to you just have to take those key aspects of sort of the cannibalism and the strongest leads, and just sort of really try and flesh that out and follow the implications of what that's going to be. And that's going to involve things like honor of a sort, or certainly kind of, you have to maintain your a certain face to the rest. You have to be seen in a certain way by the rest of the orcs. You have to be seen to be strong. Your actions are going to be being judged for any moment where weakness might be interpreted from your choices. A kind of rejection of any sort of settling is going to be kind of nomadic push, because any sort of settling might accidentally end up with some sort of order of a sort, something that might approach a kind of civilization which might give them, literally mental anguish, So those are sort of things I tried to bear down on. And also the fact that I chose, as you'll have seen already, I don't think this is a big spoiler, but I've got these orcs in it that are sort of escaped slaves from the abyssal dwarves, and with the idea that they've been raised entirely in that system, in that slave system. They were born in slave pits and so on. So it's like that by definition is going to produce a different kind of orc culture, even with the same, if you want to say, base instincts of whatever is driving them. And then you have that interesting opportunity to see how will there be any kind of culture clashes between those orcs and the orcs that are more typical across Pannithor, that are living and born and sort of free out on the plains or where have you. So yeah, that's a bit of a rambling answer, but that's sort of where my thoughts went. Yeah.
Dear listener, this is Chris coming to you from the past. I'm with Walton with Mark.
And I'm in the future.
And we're reminding you to listen to the Mup Lore episodes for even more lore.
Yeah. No, it works. I mean, at the end of the day, I think that's one of the tricky things about lore, and lore is going to be a bigger part of Kings of War going forward. We've all heard it, and with orcs, it's kind of establishing what are really orcs, and you have to also remember that it's been about 3,800 years since the God War, when they were actually created by the Wicked Ones, and the Wicked Ones got shoved down in the abyss. So the orcs have kind of been on the mortal, on the surface, doing their own thing for about 3,800 years. So you kind of would expect some kind of culture, some kind of like traditions to kind of seep into that orcish culture, and it's cool to just see what those things are, and also. And hopefully this isn't too much of a spoiler of how they see the gods and, the ones that did create them. There is some some interesting kind of discussions and conflict when it comes to the gods and and basically their makers. And yeah, you're right. The Abyssal Dwarf touch, and there's no spoiler to say that the character Ord is a really good character to follow when you're seeing that journey. You're seeing kind of a little bit of PTSD thrown in there, and it's understandable PTSD. If you're a slave, you're not exactly going to be a well-adjusted person when you actually don't become a slave anymore. Just it's one of the sad natures of humanity, really. If you torture someone, but ultimately, yeah, it's a very interesting take at it, and so we've obviously read some of the book. We haven't fully completed it, but it's. You can kind of see his point of view as you go through the book, and it's a really good flip side to the humans that you're finding out about as well. And actually, going on to that point, I think we'll ask the same question because you obviously this is a kingdom of men's kind of story, an orc story. So we actually find a lot about I believe it was the young kingdoms, are they called? What am I thinking of? The successor kingdom, sorry. And that there's a lot of kingdoms in the successor kingdoms, but we don't actually know a lot about them. We know little events that have happened here and there, but we don't actually know what kind of cultures they are. And we do see a lot of those different kind of characters from all these different kingdoms in this book, which would be a really difficult thing probably from a writer of how do I kind of say the differences between all these cultures without them kind of seeming really samey after a while. So, I mean, I don't know if it was too much of thinking went into it, but I'm just might as well throw the question out there. When you came to approach them and had so little information about all these kind of little nations of what they do, how did you approach it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, it's definitely, I mean, if we think about what Kingdoms of Men are in the game, in as a list for Kings of War the game, they are really a way in. They're a way in for historical armies. They're a way in for other sort of human generic armies to come in and try the Kings of War rule set. Not just try. Obviously, there are people very dedicated to playing Kingdoms of Men, and they can still do very well. But I think it's generally agreed that they're kind of the sort of a sort of very mid army because they're there to sort of try a bit of everything without being super special in anything. And so, given that that's their sort of generic, sure, exactly, and so they're that way in for players of other systems, but also they are a thing in themselves, and you've got to respect that as well. That people are very attached to Kingdoms of Men as a list and their place in the game. But you want, so thinking about that as a way in terms of the game, I was thinking you also kind of want them to be a way in terms of the world to some degree. They should be somewhat more relatable directly to maybe certain historical periods or factions and so on, and of human history, and in a way that, because obviously you can relate to the fact that the Basileans are humans, but they've got this very different societal structure based around how they are actually directly in contact with their gods and so on, and with the presence of the abyss being so close to them and so on. Whereas Kings of Men have got a nice bit of distance from all that, in the successor kingdoms and the young kingdoms or wherever a player might choose to think their faction comes from. So you want to kind of point the way, the way I was thinking about it is you want to point to this idea that the Kings of Men are very flexible. They can be whatever you, the player coming into this world, sort of want them to be. You can take Roman armies, you could take medieval armies, you could even take early imperial armies and have a lot of gunpowder going on, and it should all fit, and it should all sort of fit in the lore as well to some degree, although you'll have that opportunity as the player to sort of adjust where you sort of slot them in. And so definitely when I was approaching, I didn't want to put too much there. I didn't want to lay down, here is everything about Genetza, for example. Here's every single detail about their society. I mean, apart from anything, that wouldn't be very interesting to read just as a big, sort of history or what have you of their culture. But you want to give some suggestions about sort of ideas that could point people the right way, and not just for that faction. Again, it's if I'm reading this and I can see that this is how they're interpreting Janetza. It's sort of to my mind, it was a bit like I imagine Janetza being somewhat similar to Venice, of at its sort of high point in power in the Mediterranean. It's like, okay, well, that's a sort of inspiration there. So what if I want to do something that's more like, I don't know, some other part of Western Europe or beyond, that's the sort of thing I could do, put a little fantastical twist here or there. So yeah, definitely it was a case of wanting to pepper some of the differences, as you say. There's so much potential to be varied, and since mechanically in the game they are by design, like generic, so that they can be varied. You can bring any sort of human army to the game that way. They should be a sort of opportunity for any sort of human faction to sort of have a little place, a little corner of Western Mantica, as the continent's still called. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you described some of the cities like Jinzia. I don't know how you pronounce it. Yeah, that's it. You actually describe what the island looks like. And it's quite interesting because I don't think that it's ever been described that way. And it's given me a completely different perspective of what that island actually is now. So, and there's a few instances there that how you describe things, which, actually do make sense in the lore. And it'll be interesting to see how people kind of interpret that and if people really kind of run with that idea, because, it's a, I liked a lot of the descriptions that you had for certain places that we have known in the past. So it's a really good world building. This novel definitely helped me, flesh out kind of the visual element in my brain about this particular area of the world as well, which is, it's really good. It's one of those things that not a lot of writers can do well, and I think you've done really well here. So I guess we actually got a question from Kodos in our Discord, because I threw it out there that we're gonna talk to you, and this is kind of hitting on what we were just talking about, but I'll let you answer it. When writing about human fantasy kingdoms, how hard is it to avoid falling into historical cliche, or has there ever been a part of the story that you thought needed to change after writing because you realized it was too similar to one? Now, I know all stories are kind of derivative of another story and all that stuff, but I guess just take that as you can.
Sure, yeah. Historical cliches. I suppose I'm not really sure what your question is driving at, I'm afraid. I mean, just through sheer ignorance on my part, I admit I don't read a huge amount of historical fiction typically, so I wouldn't know sort of cliches that you might be thinking of. But I mean, I can certainly say that my approach to writing fantasy and relating that to history, I think, so you get some writers who are very knowledgeable of history, military history, and so on, and will really want to stick to some of that knowledge, or a lot of that knowledge, when they're writing fantasy. And while I definitely think there's a lot that's really useful in that approach, and it's definitely worth knowing a certain amount of history so that you can apply, so things can feel quite real and grounded to some degree. I'm not, most of the time, I'm not too concerned with being super accurate on to the nth sort of detail. For me, it's like, if I can insert this thing and it makes the story better, then yes, that's going in. But if I can't really see a way that it improves anything, and if it's just sort of like, I'm putting this in a way that just is there just to be sort of more, to point towards some aspect of history, but it doesn't actually add anything beyond that, I'm less inclined. I would never say that I haven't done it. I just can't think at the moment. And as to the other part of the question, sorry, go on. Yeah, to the other half of the question about like changing things to similarity, not that I can think of. Nothing sort of after the book was done. I didn't need to. There's nothing I could think of that where I want to go back and change anything because of similarities I can think of. But there was a moment when sort of I was midway through the manuscript, and I can't recall at what point. It doesn't really matter, but I remember my brother is quite is also a writer and also a war gamer, and so I bounce a lot of ideas off him. And I remember at the time I had not finished. I won't say which one, but there was one of the Tales of Pannithor books I had not finished, and he had, and I bounced this idea for something I could add in to Claws on the Plain of my brother, and he said, you might want to avoid that, and he pointed me to the page on this other book, and I said, oh, okay, no, that's fine. It wasn't exactly the same, but it was similar enough where it was sort of like, we don't need that that repetition perhaps there, but yeah, so definitely this sort of thing does happen. Yeah. I'll leave that up to.
I mean, there's so many ideas in the world. So, I mean, everyone's bound to repeat themselves. And I mean, if you avoid copying anyone, you're never going to write anything because everyone will compare it to something. So you'll go mental. Yeah, you go mental. I mean, there's a reason why art is art, and it's all about interpretation. It's all perspective. So, so yeah, that's cool. That's good. That a lot of people, I think, sometimes also ask the question of whether writers writing for Pannithor actually read the other books as well, because there isn't quite a lot of cross-pollination when it comes to kind of storylines and so forth. So it's good to know that you're doing that as well, that you're actually reading the other books and seeing what else is thrown in there, because an IP like this is so massive that it's hard to probably absorb all the content for that IP and then make sure that your book doesn't contradict anything else, and it'll be a very hard challenge. So it's good to hear that you do read the other books, because they're great reads. So I guess the question I would have, because you did say you proposed the book, it must have been in 2017, 2018, it is around about the Edge of the Abyss time. So, and obviously this is coming out in 2025, so it's a good 7 years there. How did, I guess, the book evolve from when you first kind of came up with that first draft to what's actually now being released, which from what I heard actually sold pretty well in Adepticon, so congrats on that, and there's a lot of interest in that. So I guess being the first writer, and this is probably the first time you're going through this process, from the discussions I've had with people that are first writers, it's a very hard one, because they're seeing their work kind of needing to be chopped a lot, changed a lot before release. It's just because that's just the nature of publishing, really. How was your experience being a first writer?
Yeah, definitely. The experience of writing the book was great. I had this idea. I thought it was a good idea, and unlike I've heard some other authors talk about how their ideas have come to them. They've got maybe the first part of an idea, and they kind of have to find the rest as they go. This pretty much landed. I almost feel like, how can I take credit for it? Because to some degree, it sort of landed in my mind, fully formed, and it was just almost. I wrote it having a lot of fun and a lot of almost impatience to just get to the end, because it was just like, it's all there. I just need to fill in these gaps. So that part was great. I submitted it. Yeah, you're right. It was about 2018 when I proposed it. It must have been about 2021, I want to say, when I submitted it. And then there was a gap where naturally there were just, my understanding is the Mantic had, yeah. There was COVID time. There was also, and then there was the fact that like certain books had been, because of, to match release schedule for Mantic's other products and things, other books were pushed up in priority, and that's totally understandable. So it was strange coming back to it. I'm trying to think when I first got sort of word back for some reworkings. But yeah, it'd been a long gap. So coming back to it was quite strange in one way, because I wrote it when I was, a bit younger, and there were certain decisions I'd made in writing it that I wouldn't have made, 5 years or whatever it was later. Yeah, people change, and your approach is going to change. And but I just sort of felt, well, I'll stick to. For the most part, I didn't want to change too much. I wanted to just sort of stick to what I'd done, not word for word, but like sort of honor that the place I was in when I wrote it. But yeah, there were things that needed changed. Fortunately, my big fear, really, with the big delay was that there was going to be additions to the world and through other books that perhaps come out before me that are just going to that we're going to force changes that really would only be necessary because just like something has come in the lore that sort of throws off something that I'd done that do you know what I mean? Where it doesn't almost, it doesn't really, it's not exactly, but that like story wise, if it just, yeah, it just throws something off, and that would have been quite frustrating. But really, nothing like that. I was quite fortunate; nothing like that had come up. The space had sort of remained quite open for my book to do what it was doing. So there was just nothing. The book, I would say, there were definitely things that needed done with it, but like it is the same book and the same story, the same idea that landed with me. It just needed some pushing around of parts, and some parts that were there. There were sections that are sort of cut out of the book, but aren't actually cut out of the story. They've just been pushed into the background, if you see what I mean. So it's like in the original manuscript, there'd be like perhaps some parts that were more fleshed out, and by the end, you'd maybe see the full picture, a bit more fully. But like actually functionally, it still works with them just being pushed into the background. You pick up what's going on in the bigger picture, and or at least that's the hope anyway. But yeah.
Yeah. I think it works well because the timing, and hopefully this doesn't spoil anything, it's just telling you when the book, it basically takes place, I think, a few months after the War of the Abyss finishes. So after the Green Lady and the Trident Realm essentially flood the Abyss, kind of in the war, and this is at the Lord Draveld's wall, and the town that's kind of come out of that, because the whole idea of the wall was and Lord Draveld was supposed to be a bit of a parody of a certain person who wanted to build a wall, which is a kind of ironic that now the book's coming out about it. But yeah, it kind of, it fits right in that. So it's about it's not on the current timeline. So luckily, all that kind of set in stone. They're not going back in time and changing a lot of it. So it's before the Riftforged Orcs kind of even existed, because the rift isn't open. It's around the time the dwarfs have just been pushed out of Harpy. So it's in this really cool sweet spot of everyone kind of getting over the war, and it actually takes place, because Nature's Night takes place 2 years after the war. So this is actually the closest book to the end of the war that kind of covers a lot of that. So, and it also there's some ogre talk in there as well, which their lands have just got flooded. So it touches a little bit on everything. So I think that's why it probably holds up, is because it's done in a period that's not being touched anymore. So you can really write it out, and you can actually talk about what's going on there, because everyone up north has just got slaughtered and everything. So down here, they're kind of still doing their own thing, still kind of surviving and battling essentially the orcs that they were raging about and still are raging about. So yeah, it reminded me of actually weirdly a video game I used to play. It was called Dark Omen. It was Warhammer Dark Omen, and it's the game before that's called Warhammer: The Shadow of the Horn Rat. I think that's a little bit more of the famous one. And there's a band of mercenaries that you kind of follow, and the characters the mercenary group that you have in here really actually did make me. It reminded me of that iconic group that I always look at when I played tabletop and Warhammer. I always thought of that mercenary group when I was playing. I was a kid. I was 10, 11, something like that, and it always threw me back to that. And this group kind of made me feel bad again. And I think that's what more Pannithor kind of needs: iconic kind of groups, mercenary groups, iconic figures. And you can kind of tell that there is some, could be future stories with these characters. You definitely, I'm not going to say again. I'm heading into the spoiler territory. I don't want to ruin too much. So there could be more told. Have you thought about more things you could do with these characters, or even just other stories in Pannithor? It's like, have you kind of dipped your toes and then you want more, or is it more of a case of you dip your toes, you're happy where it lands, but what's your perspective on it?
Yeah, I mean, well, certainly with these characters, the Claws, as the mercenary company is called, they I mean, they are a classic kind of pulp fantasy sort of crew in a way, where they could they could just have stories that just go on and on, for, only restricted by the sort of lifespan of humans in the world, already, as you say, when you're saying, like, where this period that the book's set in is now kind of comfortably in the past of where the Pannithor timeline is. Already the timeline is stretched really out, probably beyond where the claws could reasonably keep up with, being only men. But they, as far as adventures and stories in that period, yeah, I mean, they could do this. That they're very much those classic kind of pulp characters. But as far, and I do have ideas about what I would do with them, but it really depends on what I would say. It depends on what the readers, how readers respond to this. At the moment there aren't any plans with Winged Hussar or Mantic to do more stories for the claws, but if this is well received, I know that both Winged Hussar and Mantic are both one of the great things about both of these organizations is that they're very receptive to their fans, to their readers and their gamers as far as what they want. So yeah, bit self-serving, but if you enjoy the book, anyone out there, and you want more, definitely make some noise, and I think it's more likely than not that something might come down the line, but it's totally in the reader's hands, I would say. And other stories, I mean, look, yeah, this is a setting that this has been said before by so many other people, but it's just so full of potential. There's so many stories that can be done in Pannithor, and yeah, I occasionally have some ideas. I'll admit I've not had an idea that's landed quite as fully formed as Claws, but I would jump, yeah, the opportunity to tell more stories in this setting. I think it's a really interesting space.
I'm Scott, aka Palette of War. Welcome to Mantic Universe podcast, and check out my YouTube and Instagram.
So, James, speaking of the fans and things like that, one of the things we're talking about right now is getting miniatures from Mantic for characters in the Winged Hussar books, and we're asking people to contact them to, request those. Do you have any specific characters from your book that you'd like to see a miniature made out of? Or, the miniature created for? Or maybe, multiple characters out of the claws? What do you think you'd like to see come to be sculpted and then used actually on the tabletop?
I mean, yeah, let's just say all of them. Why not? Let's just have a faction, call it the Claws. No, I think there's a lot of good options in there, but I think probably the ones that would be a good pitch from me and potentially from Mantic to players would be this drifts near to spoiler territory, so I won't be too specific, but I think there's an ogre character that I am thinking of would make a great miniature that I think when readers meet her, they will know exactly what I'm talking about and why, I think. So, yeah, but any of them. Yeah, I'll go with my first answer. All of them, actually. Yeah.
Well, that might be a little hard for her to pull off. So, but did you have like an orc character that you might also put in there? So we might get an ogre, an orc, and someone from the Kingdoms of Men?
An orc character, yeah. I mean, there certainly, it'd be interesting. I mean, again, drifting towards potential spoilers, but some of those orc characters and where they end up, they could make for some very interesting possibilities there. Although, of course, I mean, it depends where orcs end up overall, I suppose, in the game and in the world. The Riftforged orcs are here, and they're the hot stuff. So I think if anything new for standard orcs was offered by Mantic, not just not even a character from my book, I'd be delighted. But yeah, certainly there's a few orc characters in there. Crudger Orad could be very interesting, but depends at what point you would be choosing. Yeah.
So orcs and humans. So do you think humans are spread out throughout all of Pannithor, or do you think they're more caged in or trapped into a certain region? Orcs are everywhere. So, Garkan did a great job. So But I kind of envision them as being everywhere. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I'd say order would be perfect, but again, as I said before, it's been like 3,800 years, and the orcs could have gone everywhere in Pannithor as well. So, there is a bit of fear that maybe the next edition and some law changes will kind of, I think, everyone keeps on talking about how orcs, people are thinking orcs are going to be merged together. It doesn't necessarily mean orcs, are just going to be Riftforge orcs or orcs. I mean, they could have gone off and you could have a civilized orc culture somewhere as well. So you might be able to see these, these characters do exist in the world, but from a canon point of view, so they could go off on their own as well, and you never know what can happen. And I think that's what's exciting about the Kings of War universe, is that it is rather fresh in terms of, even though we've got thousands of years of history, it's still rather fresh in what really defines these races, what really defines what cultures are like in the world. So it's really, really exciting going forward.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, I suppose the classic take would be that humans are everywhere. I mean, we do have that tendency to get around. So I would expect that's the case, and obviously that would offer lots of opportunities for interesting other sort of human cultures and things to be introduced. But also, yeah, that idea I'd never considered about what if, humans are just really kind of isolated in this island around the Infant Sea, and because they've got the elves to the south and the dwarves to the east and so on. I mean, that's an interesting idea as well. Both are very fruitful thoughts. I expect, certainly if we look at how how Kings of Men play in the game, I think it's fair to call them they can certainly be a horde army as well. So I would expect there are hordes of humans in Pannithor generally.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people forget is the noble races. So that was the dwarfs, the elves, and the humans. They existed, before the Wicked Ones, all that created the orcs and all that. But there are other races that existed around that time, like ogres is a good one, that they existed before the Wicked Ones. They were in the Rise of Celestians as a race. So it'll be interesting to see. I'm suspecting there are many different subspecies of human out there, and we've only really seen one type because this is just isolated here. I think the map of Pannithor that we know, that we've seen, is pretty much just like, my interpretation, it's the northern hemisphere and basically a quarter of the world. So there's so much potential of where we could go in terms of subspecies of human, and what does that look like? What cultures, like, what does that look like without the influence of the Shining Ones or the Wicked Ones? If all these gods that messed up the world didn't actually exist, what would humanity on Pannithor actually look like? I think that's actually a really interesting kind of thing to explore. And one day we all, or might, I should say, you never know. World is long.
That's a very interesting thought, Dave. I mean, does the influence of the Shining Ones go? Well, yeah, but does their influence expand beyond just Pannithor? Or is it just isolated to that part? I mean, think of what type of beings they are. I mean, Basileia is all over them, but I mean, are there other cultures that do that as well, or something? Boy, I don't know. You got my brain running on that one. So
it's an ADHD thought. Yeah.
Are we going to connect the Pannithor setting with the Warpath setting? That's the real question at this point.
Yeah, that does kind of connect them in a way. Absolutely, the Night Stalkers are running around there and are basically popping in and out of both. So, I mean, and if you think about it, the vermin are, basically the ratkin. So, there's a little bit of a crossover there as well. So.
So James, I'll throw this out. Is it right to assume that you collect maybe Orc and Kings of Men armies, or because you said you play Kings of War? What's your army of choice?
Yeah, at the moment it's Orcs. I've just finished up an Orc army that I'll be lugging down to Clash of Kings this year. For my first time at Clash of Kings, so that should be a good time. It's looking like Steve Hilder's really knocking it out the park with these, so I thought I have to get in on that. So the Orcs will be coming down and doing a little raid south of the border into England, so that'll be fun. But yeah, no, I've been playing since I've been playing since the end times of Warhammer Fantasy, and everyone. I'm a refugee, like many of us, from that time, and I came over with Ratkin, or a Skaven army that became Ratkin, and I played that for most of second edition. But I've got a small Kingdoms of Men army, and that's actually something I missed when I was forgot to mention when I was talking about the inspiration in this. The absolute kernel of the idea for this book was in that after the Edge of the Abyss, which my brother and I had had so much fun playing in that campaign that he started trying to organize a narrative campaign for us all to play in with some local people who ended up sort of dropping out very early. So it never really took off, unfortunately, because I should shout out to my brother here. He wrote this fantastic set of campaign rules that really, really brilliant. I have to get that going one day. But I thought I would do Kingdoms of Men for this, and I thought, I'll need to come up with some sort of background for them. I'll make them a mercenary company, and I'll call this guy, and so on. And it was really, that was the sort of the seed that was sort of planted that eventually became, oh my God, never mind that campaign that unfortunately fell through. There's an idea for a book here. But yeah, so coming back, yes, I've got Kingdoms of Men, and I've since added Forces of Nature and so on. And I've got another army. Elves. I do have some of the Mantic elves. Sure, I quite like. It's definitely a look. It's Marmite look, as we would say here, but like I like them a lot. And but at the moment it's orcs all the way for me. Once I started writing about orcs, at the time I didn't have any. Wasn't collecting orcs when I was writing about them, but I just thought there came a point where I was like, I've got to start doing these guys. This is too fun. This is in my head now. I've got to get it out there onto the table. So, yeah.
So here's maybe a little bit of an unfair question asking our writer. What do you prefer more, competitive play or narrative play?
Yeah, it's possibly not the answer you'd expect. I do like competitive play. I'm not a super competitive player, and I wouldn't say I'm particularly good at the game. I do approach it from I want to win, and I'm typically playing, I'll try to stick to the sort of tournament standards, either of rules or, the army list sizes, or, what rules are going to be in play for whatever tournament's coming up. I'm far more inclined to want to play my games around that, so I can sort of get practice in and be approaching it from that perspective. But I mean, narrative is always just there for me with Kings of War. I think there's a funny thing where some people think Kings of War is, and I can understand why, they think it's, sort of not such a narrative game. They think it's talked about like as being more of a chess-like war game, much more of a competitive game. And there's definitely truth to all of that. I'm not arguing with that. But for me, if you compare it to games where you are having a lot of the story baked into the rules, shall we say, like Warhammer Fantasy throughout most of its editions back in the day. I don't know much about the old world or what's going on right now, but I imagine it's pretty similar, where you've got a lot of rules that are telling the story on the table, because you've got you're having to simulate these different special rules that all the things have, and that builds the story. For me, Kings of War having that sort of abstract system where units, you're not removing individual models, you're accumulating damage, and that could be physical damage, that could be mental damage, it could just be exertion. This is much more fruitful for me in terms of the story of what's going on. There's a space there where I have to make the story out of what's happening. How did this unit receive that charge? They took a lot of damage, but there's a double one was rolled, so the story is right there, for you to fill in as to how it went. Whereas, systems that simulate every sort of detail, they tell you exactly how many models died and exactly, whether they broke them or why. That obviously does tell the story, but it's less interesting for me because I'm not the one telling the story. So I suppose there's your writer's answer as to why I like Kings of War. It's just so much space for the rules to sort of just let me imagine the story how I want it to be.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I think we're going to wrap things up. I'm going to ask you a doozy of a question last. But before we do that, Mark, do you have anything before we do that?
Oh yeah. I just wanted to mention and just ask a question about the factions for Kingdoms of Men and alignment. So because Kingdoms of Men are neutral, but I envision them all over the place. So how do you fall down on the good, neutral, evil spectrum there for Kingdoms of Men? Do you think they are strictly in that neutral zone, or do you think it'd be interesting to have them have good, neutral, and evil factions or alignment, I should
Yeah,
say?
I mean, I definitely fall into the camp around this wider discussion of alignments in Kings of War, where especially now that allies are really not a thing so much in terms of a lot of competitive play. Um, I just don't. I'm not sure that it's a particularly useful thing to have in the setting, and it made sense obviously as a a mechanic for determining alignments at the time. But now that it's gone, and we're thinking about this in terms of stories and lore and where people sit, I've never been wholly convinced by it. I think possibly something like shining wicked and neutral might be more helpful just for telling people where people are aligned in terms of their culture or what have you. But um, you know, yeah, determining what is good, determining what is evil is very easy. Determining what is good and what is neutral, these are far too tricky and annoying questions for people who just want to have good stories. I don't know, but so with that answer, I suppose I fall into the camp of I think like yourself, Kings of Men being you know humans should really be able to fall uh, all over that spectrum. If you want to still use that spectrum, there should be societies that are modeled in a way that we would think of as very evil, and all the way through to what we might think of as an ideal form, given the limits perhaps of the technology. But then you can obviously bring in magic. Perhaps there's some magical way they're supplementing some sort of functioningly good system and their morals that we might think of as good. Although, again, very tricky questions. But yeah, I think they should be like just as they're a way in for all sorts of different historical factions to come in and have a place in Pannithor, there should be, that space available to say, well, okay, Kings of Men are a neutral faction, but this is my faction, and these are good guys. At least how I see them. I think that's probably my position on it.
Alignment's so hard to get right. It's just, yeah, we had a really big discussion about it, like I think a week or two ago, about alignment and how that really works. And there's a gameplay way of looking at it, but when you're looking at it from a narrative point of view, it gets a little bit more messy. So it's a hard one. Cool. All right. So I guess we'll wrap things up there now. The release date of this particular episode is actually the release date of Claws on the Plane. So if you do want the book, you can either do it digitally or by physical. I'm a physical copy kind of person, so I'm definitely getting a physical one. You can get it from the Wing TSR website, or you should be able to get the digital one from the Mantic website. Not sure when that's going to be up. Typically, they try and get it up pretty quickly after it's actually official release, but we will put the link down below to the Mantic one, and you can get the digital and the physical one there. I believe on the 15th of the 4th, which is the same date that this episode came out. And I say that first because I am going to ask a question that might upset some people. So James, we know 4th edition is coming out, and unfortunately we get the impression that a faction will be cut, unfortunately. Now, I do know that a big draw card to Kings of War is that there's so many different factions, and you can always come to it and find the faction that kind of fits your mold. But it sounds like there might be one or two cuts. So I'm going to put you on the spot. You have to pick one faction that you would not have in 4th edition. I was just throwing it out there because I realized that I want everyone to just not want this culling of 4th edition happen. So I want to throw it out there. This is the pain people are going to feel when we find out which factions are actually cut. So this is an audio representation of that pain right now.
That was evil, Dave. I gotta say.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm in agreement with yourself. I don't really see the need to cut anything at this point. I mean, I say I don't see the need. It really depends what they're going to do with fourth edition. There may end up being a need, I suppose, if they're going to make the factions more like some of the recent releases, like the sort of the Twilight Kin faction. I think if you were to have all, where are we now, 28? If we were to have them all be as detailed in terms of synergies and special rules like that, it might be overburdened. But I would still, even in that case, I would vote to have no factions culled. But if you put me on the spot for one, I don't know, maybe League of Rordia, maybe.
Oh,
but again, that would be one.
No, not the League. They're really just for a really rough time. They may be slightly racist, but they are. They are still. I don't know. I don't know how to defend the League. Actually, now I'm thinking about it, because they just really hated halflings, didn't they?
Yeah.
I think you're right.
Yeah, made their own bed there.
I think we get rid of the League. I think that's the only logical conclusion here. But yeah, sorry. Thanks for playing along with that.
Actually, yeah, yep. And actually, they're my choice too, because you know, if they do call any factions, they've got to do it through the lore, kind of like when the Brotherhood got wiped out and split into two, factions. The League's a very specific thing, so it could definitely get wiped out somehow. Like the halflings could take them over, or something. They would be definitely, and then the army that someone would have could definitely be used for Kingdoms of Men. So
yeah, I mean, we don't actually know what happened after the Reforged Orcs invaded Roydena, because how the lore went and that whole when the Shires got attacked, the Reforged Orcs attacked Roydena, and then they moved to the Shires, but they never really explained what happened to Roydena. So, for all we know, they could be pretty wiped out at this current stage. So, but no, I want to keep all the factions for the record. I'm just putting it out there. But yeah, I think the League may get the cull. I don't know. Yeah, keep all the factions. Anyway. Thanks so much, James, for joining us here. We'll hope to have you on a future episode to actually talk about spoilers of the book. It's really hard to talk about a book without spoiling it, so I think we danced around that well enough. And if you have any questions, what's the best way for anyone to reach out to you? Are you on Facebook? Is there, Twitter, Blue Sky, anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, probably the best way, if you have any questions, is through Facebook. I'm on all the sort of major groups, including, obviously the Fanatics, but also the more lore-specific, the Pannithor lore page. I'm on there as well. And, yeah, I do have Blue Sky. I don't recall off the top of my head, but if anyone can find me on there, you can feel free to throw some questions at me there as well. But it should be just something like James Dunbar. But yeah.
Cool. So yeah, if anyone wants to join the Discord as well, because we're going to have hopefully more writers on in the future. All the links are down below. We've got our Facebook. We've got what have we got? Facebook, Discord. We've got Patreon, and yeah, I think what else we got? I think that's about it. That's about it. I'm tired. It's been a long day. Anyway,
there you go. And remember to visit the Kings of War wiki.
Yes, I spend way too much time doing that goddamn wiki, and it keeps getting attacked by Russian bots, and I can't stop it. but that's just something that happens. That's my life for you. But yeah, well
there you go. And one more thing, actually, Dave, we've got to visit the Kings of War forums. Our man Fred is running the Kings of War forum, so definitely check those out as well.
Yeah, and there's a link on the wiki that leads to all that as well, if you need the link. Cool. Do you want to sign us off, Mark? I'm terrible at that.
Well, hey, thanks so much for joining us, James. We really appreciate it. We look forward to having you back for a more book club style of episode, so we can kind of go into the book a little bit more in depth, and we'll really, really enjoy that. So I've been looking forward to it. I've had this book on pre-order for years. So I'm glad it's finally coming out. And Brandon was telling us that the books at Adepticon were flying off the shelf. They were selling like hotcakes, right, Dave?
Yeah, apparently hotcakes is a type of pancake, right?
Yeah, that's it. And they cook fast. So, but so there was great sales at Adepticon, and we're really, really looking forward to it coming out. From me, Mark, and Wiki Dave, and from James, thank you so much for joining us. And until next time, take care.